Iraqis are going back to the polls this month for the sixth time since the US-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein 20 years ago. It is expected to be one of the most contested election cycles in the country. Political factions are competing for power, both in parliament and through armed militias, many backed by Iran. Some candidates are accused of performative, empty promises, some of them of nepotism and clientelism, and others of vote buying. The electoral law has changed over the years, giving more leverage to one bloc or another. Now, many people are planning to boycott the elections altogether. They're fed up with the same old guard and little political reform. But the power ploys are not happening in vacuum. Foreign influence from Tehran and Washington could also shape the outcome of this election and the policies of the next government. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. In this episode, we'll look at the political challenges facing Iraq ahead of the poll opening on November 11 and ask what it means for millions in the country who have waited too long for democratic change. To understand the tug and pull between candidates and parties, it's important to bring some context to explain who's who, what they're after, and why voters are losing hope. To talk more about this, I'm joined by Aveen Karim, the National's deputy foreign editor. Aveen, there's a widespread sense of disillusionment and apathy among Iraqi voters in this election. Why is that?
Well, to put it simply, it's because of the general state that Iraq is in now. Although this election right now is happening at a, let's say, more relative calm period in Iraq where you don't have active conflict, but still there is a major lack in basic services, lack in employment opportunities for the youth. And we need to point out the fact that most of the Iraqi population, the majority, is under the age of 25. They feel like they don't have the opportunities to make it in life inside their own country. Things like electricity, clean water, just very basic necessities still don't exist for every Iraqi. And this election is happening 20 years since the constitution in 2005, which is what enshrined the current parliamentary system that exists in Iraq. And with each election since, you've seen an even lower turnout than the one before. A lot of them, I think, just won't feel the need to go out and vote because there's a lot of mistrust as well in the political system. It's still a system that exists within just clientelism and patronage networks that have existed since 2005. And I think at this point, people just don't really see any point in going out to vote.
So their poor living conditions are not a motivator, but rather a deterrent for them to go out and vote.
Yeah, I think because they still haven't seen any change. And we had widespread protests in 2019 where people were just demanding these basic necessities that we already mentioned. And there still hasn't been much difference on the ground. Of course, there's much more appetite for foreign investment in Iraq right now than there was a few years ago because the security situation has improved significantly. But we're still not really seeing the fruits of all of this.
So who are the main players in the election? We know there's Prime Minister Sudanese coalition and his now rival, former ally, Nouri al-Maliki and his party. There are many competing Shia factions, Sunni-led factions and Kurdish factions. Who do we need to be watching and why?
Although people are free to go out and vote for whoever they want, you still have people voting along ethno-sectarian lines. So when you look at the Shia factions, because this is a Shia majority country, we'd be looking at Sudanese Reconstruction and Development Coalition. Like you said, Nouri al-Maliki, former Iraqi prime minister, his state of law coalition. And then you also have the more Iran-aligned factions like Qais al-Khazali, who is actually a US-sanctioned head of a militia group in Iraq, his Sadiqun party, and someone like Hadi al-Amiri as well in his Badr brigades. But essentially, although all of these Shia factions are running on separate ballots, the way it works at the end is once the elections are done, it's not the largest bloc that ends up being the winner. It's the largest coalition. So what happens is usually these factions tend to end up forming an alliance later on together with the main Kurdish and Sunni party. So before, the Kurdish parties used to form an alliance, a more allied front as well in Iraqi elections. But this time, I guess because of increasing divisions in the Kurdistan region as well, where there still isn't a government 1 year since Kurdish parliamentary elections, This time, the main parties such as the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, as well as the New Generation Movement, are also running on separate ballots and will most likely end up in different alliances with the Iraqi parties at the end. And then when you look at the Sunnis, you have the former Iraqi Parliament Speaker Mohammed al-Halbousi and his party, the Taqadum Alliance, Azm Alliance, and Al-Siyada as well. So these are the main ones.
Historically, of course, Iran has had a more explicit say in elections, as you mentioned, with some of the Iran-backed factions. Is this still the case now, particularly since they have become, it seems, less influential in the region over the last 2 years with the 12-day war in Israel and its proxies like Hezbollah weakened across the region?
Like I said, even though it's an era of relative calm within Iraq itself, you can't remove Iraq from the wider region. And obviously, the last 2 years have been extremely tense and very volatile. But somehow Iraq has managed to remain on the sidelines of regional conflict. So, for example, in the 12-day war with Israel and Iran, it didn't get involved. Even throughout the war in Gaza, like we saw other proxies such as Hezbollah and Houthis heavily involved in the conflict, whereas the Iraqi militias, I mean, they launched a few or claimed to have launched a few missiles towards Israel, but other than that, they've remained largely on the sidelines. So for sure, Iran will be monitoring the election very closely because the militia groups, the proxies it has in Iraq, are pretty much the only or the strongest line that Iran has at the moment. So it will try to do what it can to make sure it preserves them because this is pretty much all it has left. There's a lot of militia groups that are running into politics as well. Like I mentioned, figures who were traditionally militia or more military figures could now become even further entrenched in Iraqi politics. So I think Iran is still very much heavily involved in the elections, but you also have a lot of US interests happening at the moment.
So we're not expecting to see any big twists or changes or surprises this time around, even though there are some small but significant regional changes?
No, I don't anticipate much of a surprise. Actually, the surprise would be if we have a higher voter turnout this year than we did last time. But another surprise would be if Sudani is named prime minister again. But we have a very long road until then. I think that's one important thing about the way elections work and have worked in Iraq, is that you don't have results a day after the election and then that's it, everything is settled. It's such a long process. You have to have parliament convene. They have to name a president who usually has to be Kurdish. Then the president has to name a prime minister who has to be Shia, and then so on and so forth. But last time it took 1 year to form a government and reach that point.
You mentioned the voter turnout being low several times. Could this be because, partially at least, because of Muqtada al-Sadr? What can you tell us about that?
So, of course, the absence of Muqtada al-Sadr from the elections is a very important factor and a huge factor in the reason why a lot of people are boycotting. He is one of the most influential Shia clerics, and he has announced his boycott and has pretty much told his supporters to stay at home and not vote. In fact, there have been cases where some of his members have been removed because they've expressed support for certain candidates or for the process. But ultimately, you always end up having this sort of consensus government, which is what exists in place now, where you need to have a sort of blessing from all these influential figures and all these influential parties. So, I think when it gets to the point of picking the people that will be in power, I think he will have a say and give some sort of approval.
The lead up to the election has been anything but smooth. One candidate was killed in a car bombing. More young people are vowing to boycott the polls, and a change to the electoral law has weakened independent candidates. Meanwhile, the militias keep Iraq between a rock and a hard place, with foreign powers using them as bargaining chips. To discuss all of this, I speak to Renad Mansour, MENA Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Iraq Initiative at Chatham House. Renad, you've labeled this as a billionaire's election. What exactly do you mean by that?
What we mean is there are incredible sums of money being spent by candidates and by Iraq's political elites in these elections. Millions around the country, in ways investing not just in the billboards that now are littered across all the sort of streets that you see around Iraq, but also in attempts to buy candidates, in attempts to make promises for people to vote. because the turnout is so low, because many Iraqis over the 20 years of elections now have kind of realized that they don't feel that their vote actually produces change through government, then politics has become very retail. It's become very transactional. This is what I give to you for you to vote for me. And it's primarily a promise for a job, a promise for a contract or such. So I don't want to completely remove ideology or other reasons, but in Iraq, in these elections, there's not a policy debate. There isn't a let's move the government towards a more leftist or rightist economy or relations with Iran or the US. There's no real policy platforms from the different parties. There's no debates. It's all this type of retail politics.
We're still talking about the basics of improving standard of living, providing jobs, the basic things that people need. Is this the reason why we're still stuck in that kind of arena?
I think that's right. This is a government that has a lot of money. I mean, Iraq's budgets for the last few years have been over 100 billion US dollars. And yet much of that wealth isn't really being felt by many citizens. You still have electricity shortages, water shortages, basic healthcare needs aren't being met. And instead, you have a ballooning public sector. You don't have a private sector as much. Iraq has all of this oil, which translates to a big government budget. So let's hire more and more each year, hundreds of thousands each year, not to necessarily do anything in that public sector job, but just so that person and their family can then support the system.
Apart from people like Muqtada Sadr calling for a boycott of the elections, there has also been an unprecedented wave of banned candidates. What's the reason for this? Is it an attempt to ban certain candidates or certain parties because of what they represent?
The promise was that this would turn into a democracy where candidates could compete for elections. It's never always been that case. Back in the earlier elections, there was this huge de-Baathification where many candidates who were Sunni, for example, were just being disqualified, whether true or not, under this de-Baathification label. So it's always been the case that the ruling elites, if they don't like a candidate, if they think a candidate is going to push against their interest or create a problem for them, they will ban them from the election. It makes it a political election, and it really challenges the independence of institutions like the judiciary and the electoral commission, which is meant to be making sure that nobody has the kind of impunity to simply ban candidates.
So it's not because they're being more rigorously vetted.
I mean, I'm not sure what rigor has ever been implemented, but it's political, right? Look, some of them might be vetted for criminal or terrorist or Ba'athist charges. Yeah. But it's clear that some of the more prominent ones that we've seen have been political. The word decent, for example, decency, is now a legal term in a way that can easily be interpreted to say, oh, did that person give a speech that we think was indecent to the state? So it's very subjective, let's say.
Prime Minister Soudani has been gaining power since taking office and will be looking for a second term. How likely is this to happen, do you think?
Having studied Iraq for a long time, I've learned never to give predictions because things never happen the way one predicts. However, that being said, I can make a prediction. I can try and say that it is highly unlikely for Soudani to retain the premiership. First of all, note that an election winner in Iraq's history of elections has never moved on to form the government. Election winner has never made the government. That means that the winner of the election each time did not become prime minister. With the first prime minister in the kind of post-election was Nouri al-Maliki, who wasn't the candidate who represented in the 2005 election. In 2010, Ayad Alawi won the election, but Nouri al-Maliki became prime minister. He had come second. In 2014, al-Maliki won the election, but Haider al-Abadi became prime minister. And you can go on and on. The point is, the prime minister is often preferred by the ruling elites of Iraq to be someone who is weak, someone who is a compromise candidate, and someone who doesn't necessarily then threaten their interests. And so Soudani, at the moment, has had 3 years of prime minister, because it took a whole year, by the way, just to form that government, has had 3 years of being prime minister. In those 3 years, he has focused on building infrastructure, bridges, all of these things that make Baghdad slightly different today than it was in the past. He's gained some popularity, but from the perspective of the elites, that's okay, that's your turn, done. You will win the election. Probably Sudanis, and the polling shows that Sudani will win this election. However, that does not mean then that we want this person to have a second term, because he can then become too powerful. And then we have a problem.
Can you explain what the Popular Mobilization Front's connection is with a Sudani?
So the Popular Mobilization Forces is it's an umbrella of many different armed groups, some of which are aligned closely with Iran, others that developed through the war against ISIS. But several of these groups and their leaders run in elections. So they're not just armed groups. Some of them are Sudanese competitors. I mean, all of them are Sudanese competitors, but Sudanese list, let's say, will be competing not just against Maliki for the Shia vote, but also against Qais al-Khazali, who's a PMF leader who has his own Sadiqun bloc. Hadi al-Amri, the Badr organization, is another PMF bloc. They represent different political groups. Also, by the way, even within Sudanese bloc, for example, the minister Ahmed al-Assadi is formerly from the Popular Mobilization Forces as well. So even within the coalition, you have this. So suffice it to say that the Popular Mobilization Forces, the groups that fought against ISIS from 2014 to 2017, are now a well-established political blocs within the Iraqi state across the spectrum.
If they're not supporting a Sudani, then who are they supporting in these elections? Or do they just run, as you mentioned, different blocks and then those blocks win?
Yeah, so the PMF, who in previous elections used to be almost one electoral coalition, over the years, they've also fragmented. So now they're each competing against each other. What they want to do is to see who gets more seats, and then to use those seats then to divide the larger stake of the Iraqi state. So this is not to say necessarily that they're fighting against each other, but they're competing against each other, but they're in the state, right? These are not non-state actors. They're very much deeply embedded in the Iraqi state, and they're competing in these elections to try and get a bigger share of that state.
But he's also under pressure from Washington to disarm them, right? So does that mean he only has to make the US happy in order to remain in power?
This is where I think the US angle becomes significant for these Iraqi elections. Iraq is not on the radar of the US when it comes to the Middle East. The Trump administration and Steve Witkoff's office are focusing, when they think of the Middle East, on Iran, Israel, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, but not as much Iraq. However, when they have focused on Iraq, the focus has been twofold. One, on businesses. So you've had the return of very major US firms to Iraq. So ExxonMobil, Chevron are back in Iraq. So there is an improved economic relationship there. But at the same time, the Trump administration has still been adamant that that Sudani and any Iraqi government needs to remove Iran's influence from Iraq, including to remove the Popular Mobilization Forces from the political scene. Now, all that being said, I think where the US influence becomes significant here is that the coordination framework, the ruling coalition, and the Popular Mobilization Forces have anxieties and are worried about the US. They're worried about Israel in the kind of post-war October 7th context, because they've seen what's happened in Lebanon, what's happened in Syria, what's happened in Yemen, what's happened in Palestine, in Iran. Iraq has remained somehow stable in this context. And part of why they think that is the case is because the Iraqi government has had relations with the US. Until recently, there were US troops in Baghdad. You have US companies in Iraq. Even though many of these actors in the coordination framework publicly in the past have wanted antagonistic relations publicly with the US, they now appreciate how integral the US could be to Iraq's own stability, which for them, because they're now in the state, means that their business is at jeopardy. So going against the US or being on the wrong side of the US is bad for business for them.
How big of a role do you see Iran playing in these elections as compared to previous years, given the change in influence of Iran in the region?
Iran, for a long time now, has been the most significant external influence on Iraq. However, given the regional context today and the setbacks that Iran has had in the region, it's lost a bit of its ability, let's say, to maneuver, and therefore it's now having to adapt to a new dynamic and to a new type of defense doctrine. Iraq is a cornerstone of Iran's adaptation. Unlike Hezbollah in Lebanon or even the Assad regime in Syria, which was removed, Iraq is on Iran's border. They share a very long border. So it is an immediate security threat and an immediate buffer for Iran. Two, Iran, under increasing sanctions, needs Iraq as an economic lifeline. Iraq is where Iran could have access to international financial markets, to the US dollar, to ways of transporting some of its goods, sanctioned fuel, as we've seen, and others. So from the both security and economic perspectives, wherever Iran ends up in its adaptation to the war with Israel, and the war is not over, by the way, Iraq needs to be stable. And we saw, for example, in the Israel-Iran war, Iran and the Iraqi PMF sides decided to exercise restraint in Iraq. So when it comes to these elections, while Iran will still have influence, it does not want there to be a Shia fighting between, for example, the Sadrists and the Coordination Framework or the PMF. Anything that could destabilize Iraq right now would be a problem for how Iran is trying to adapt.
So what is the biggest challenge facing the government? To actually be an efficient government, regardless of who wins?
The biggest challenge is corruption. The fact that Iraq has so much money, as I said, the budget of over $100 billion, and yet can't provide electricity or water or simple governing factors, is because you have a system of corruption that is politically sanctioned. But this is why the elites are super competitive when it comes to elections, because the way Iraq's democracy works is you get your seats, then you can take those seats and you use them as bargaining tools, as these chips, to say, okay, I got this many seats, this means I can get this ministry. Lost in all of this process are the people who just want a basic standard of living.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi with editorial guidance from Sinan Mahmoud, the National's Baghdad correspondent. It was audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. Thank you for listening.